In an anechoic chamber, usually the floor is made out of wire mesh, and there are these absorbers below you as well. So there's no place for the sound to bounce off of. It's crazy, and they're so quiet that one of the most common sensations or complaints is if people spend quite a bit of time in there, especially by themselves, the loudest sound you hear is your own blood circulating.
Hi, and welcome to And If Love Remains. I'm your host, Mike Levitt, and we have our co-host today, Dr. Elias Axel Pedersen, on the line. Welcome to the show, Elias.
Hey, Mike. Great to be back. Very excited about today.
Absolutely. Me too. And we also have on the line Brett Leonard. We've had him on before. He's a good friend of the program. We're excited to have him on. He is a recording engineer, an audio researcher, and audio educator. He's currently serving as the director of music technology music technology programs at the University of Indianapolis. He's an active freelance recording engineer. He has worked on projects ranging from orchestras to progressive jazz, hip hop to classic rock, including projects with artists such as Lenny Pickett, Matt Hemovitz, Jerry Douglas, Cecile McLaurin Salvant, and the National Youth Orchestra of Canada. He currently serves as the chief recording engineer of the Chelsea Music Festival in New York. In 2007, he began BLP Audio, a company providing recording services, acoustical consulting, system design, and equipment rental. And he provides consulting services to numerous private studios, event spaces, performance venues, and he focuses on spatial audio and the interplay between acoustics, instruments, and the recording process. So good to have you back on the show, Brett. Thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Now, I kind of want to geek out right away. So
let's do it.
I just learned about this cool thing, in the last several years called an Anechoic Chamber. And it's funny, like whenever, and I'm a total amateur engineer recording guy, I'm a musician primarily.
Yep.
But I know a little bit. I've done some recording, and whenever I give advice to people, I try to remind them that they're not recording an instrument; they're recording the room that the instrument is in.
Amen.
And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind. That although that doesn't necessarily apply with the Anechoic Chamber. So
right.
Can you explain what that is and why they're so cool?
Yeah. So Anechoic Chambers are just these kind of unearthly spaces. If you ever get a chance to go in one, even if you're, not musical, not into acoustics, the experience is just kind of insane. So they were designed for research. They were designed for very exacting, high quality measurements of acoustic and actually radio frequency energy as well. You see a lot of them in use for developing cell phones and, mobile devices, wireless cards, things like that.
That's interesting. That makes sense. It's because it is so sensitive. That I didn't think of it that way, but you're right.
Yeah, actually, some of the biggest ones in use today. The biggest one, I believe, still to this day, is owned by the U.S. government, and they can test cargo planes in it. The thing is massive.
Wow,
but there's pictures of a tank and a jet in it, and you're like, holy,
that's
it's warehouse.
What are they exactly? I mean, how are they designed?
Yeah, so it's a room that is designed with very good acoustic isolation. So usually they build a building, and then inside the building, they actually cut the foundation or pour a separate foundation inside that's completely disconnected from the outer walls. And then they build a separate building with high density building materials inside. And they usually, quote unquote, float it. A lot of people hear floating floor.
Mm-hmm.
Well, same concept. They actually put it on either giant spring isolators or foam rubber isolators. So if a truck drives past and is shaking the ground, that vibration doesn't make its way to the interior.
Wow.
Then inside, they put, depending on the size, anywhere from hundreds to thousands of these huge foam wedges or fiberglass wedges that are sometimes a couple of meters deep, and they absorb sound very effectively and at all frequencies. So you go in, and the reason it's so sort of unearthly and strange
So
is
quiet.
you say something or you play a sound or you play something through a speaker and no sound comes back to you. Whatever hits you directly, that's what you get. And when it hits the walls, it's gone. It's
Mhm.
Yeah.
absorbed, it's dissipated. And it doesn't sound like it'd be that crazy, but even a fairly dead recording studio, there's still a floor. There's still some sort of ceiling. In an anechoic chamber, usually the floor is made out of wire mesh,
Mm.
and there are these absorbers below you as well. So there's no place for the sound to bounce off of. It's crazy. And they're so quiet that one of the most common sensations or complaints is if people spend quite a bit of time in there, especially by themselves, the loudest sound you hear is your own blood circulating.
Yeah, wow. Gosh. That must
It's
be
That's
so
crazy.
eerie.
insane.
Yeah, you're like, okay, I don't like this anymore. Like it's very disconcerting, especially if you don't know what to expect. And there's an urban legend, who knows if it's true or not, of somebody who actually accidentally got locked in an anechoic chamber overnight. And there's now an emergency latch on most anechoic chambers that are built today, because this person lost touch with reality and had some medium term mental health effects
Wow.
of being stuck in this crazy space,
Yeah.
where you scream as loud as you can, no one's going to hear you, you talk to yourself and you can barely hear your own voice. It's just crazy.
Well, and I could almost imagine, it feeling, so especially if it's dark, but
Yes.
but being in a space, it'd be so disconcerting because you feel so collapsed, especially if it's like I imagine being in that U.S. government one, where it's giant and yet you feel like you're in a closet. That would just be so strange.
Yeah, it really is crazy. The other thing that I noticed, I've been in a few. I was in one in Japan and a couple in North America, and if you go into with a group or with a couple of people, and you're talking like we are now, we're
Mhm.
no big deal. We're conversing, in a nice normal tone. You come out and your voice is sort of raw because you feel like you're yelling to be
Oh,
heard even a couple of feet away, because we just don't have that little extra support from the desk and the floor and the walls and the chairs, everything that sound normally bounces off of.
Wow. You'd have to maybe hold your hands up in front of your face to hear a little bit more sound,
Yeah,
and even then it would probably dissipate so quickly.
yeah, cup your ears, or people sort of get kind of what would normally be like uncomfortably close, like whisper close just to
Yeah.
have a normal conversation. It's
Oh,
crazy.
so weird. How many are there? I mean, are they ubiquitous? Are there some at universities? It must cost a lot to create them.
Yeah, they're incredibly expensive. So they're not quite as frequently found as one might hope. I would say most major cities usually have either a private company or a university that has one. There's probably a couple hundred in the United States, but yeah, they often quote, you're talking $2-3 million, even for one that's just the size, once it's completed, for like a person to sit in a chair by themselves.
Wow.
So when you start talking about ones that you can fit cars in to test engine noise, or fit planes in to test jet engines or anything like that, it's tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
and
Wow.
and the I guess one of the benefits of it, because it almost does take away all space. So, if you don't need to test a jet engine, the difference in the sound is going to be the same whether it's 100 feet or 10 feet. You know,
Exactly. Yeah, unless that's really a part of the research being done, because there's some acoustic research where they're measuring spread over space or something. But yeah, if you're measuring headphones, let's say, or a phone, you expect that device to probably be within 5-6 feet at the very most of sort of where you're interested. So you can put it in the center, and then as long as you have that sort of 5 or 6 feet of range, you're pretty well covered. But what gets really wild is when you're measuring. So they actually take other acoustic treatment into these crazy acoustic spaces to test it. It's like
It's so meta.
It's some weird Inception thing going on. But so Joe builds his perfect acoustic diffuser, which is supposed to scatter sound in a very precise way. They'll take this 2 foot by 2 foot panel into a giant anechoic chamber. They'll shoot sound at it, and then they'll measure, okay, how is it at 2 feet? How is it at 4 feet? How is it at 10 feet? How is it at 50 feet? So they can map it all out precisely. So then all of a sudden, oh man, we need 25, 30, 40 feet in every direction, or at least in 2 directions. So it gets, it's, if you ever get a chance, there's a couple of great articles on when Apple opened their new headquarters. I want to say they have like 8 or 9 anechoic chambers that they use for different device testing, and they have some incredible pictures. I mean, it looks like something out of a sci-fi movie. They're just incredible.
That'd be a good escape room type of
right.
Escape before you lose your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is interesting. Like the way our brain has evolved, we have learned how to hear in a very specific way,
Right.
so that our brain's able to cancel certain things, able to, focus on other things, and which kind of, adds to another conversation of how our modern society is kind of messing with that, our hearing that way. But it is interesting when you put yourself in an environment that way, how it just messes up all of evolution.
Yeah. Well, and it's fascinating. I was so bummed last year. I had to skip one of my favorite in-class demonstrations because of COVID and trying to keep everyone, separated and whatnot. But I generally have, I bring in like a big brick of cheap modeling clay or something like that can mold a little bit and has a little tackiness to it. And I have everyone fill up the little indentation in their ear, not the actual canal, just that little indentation called the concha. And it's crazy how much it affects you. And I have them do it at the beginning of class, and by the end of 45 minutes, no one's paying attention to it anymore, because our brain can respond so quickly to these new environments or these new conditions that the brain adapts over 20, 30 minutes to something like that. Wow. Then they take it out and they go right back to being like, okay, what just happened? At the end of class. And it's incredible, the resiliency, but also how finely tuned we are to these tiny little, contours of our outer ear that you'd think, oh, that's no big deal. I'll pierce it. Who knows? That might actually change the way you hear for a few days until your body sort of rebuilds its mapping of how sound enters your ear.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's just our all of our senses, when you have these researchers that go into a cave or something and want to spend a week in there, and they almost go crazy just because of the difference in light. They don't know when darkness actually is happening. Their bodies, their circadian rhythms get off.
Yes.
That's a visual thing. And also the sound in there is so different, and you're so isolated. You don't have any feedback. It's, like you say, I'm sure that myth has some truth to it. You can really go crazy.
Well, yeah, and you're totally right about light and having that feedback from some external visual sense as well.
Yeah.
There are documents that basically show that various government agencies looked into sensory deprivation as a method of interrogation, and it was sound and light. Those were the two easiest things to do. You put somebody in a dark room and you put them in a room where they can't hear anything else.
Yeah.
So
go crazy. It's amazing.
Wow. Well, I want to kind of, it's because of great technology like Anechoic Chambers and stuff. It's interesting how the audio equipment industry is changing, and it seems to be getting better and better. Where cheaper devices seem to work more consistently.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm curious, like, if you're giving advice to somebody who's maybe just getting started or wants to have like a bedroom, little production space or whatever, um, you know, uh, are you, how much are you focusing on technique versus gear and wow, it's
Yeah,
starting
And
to rain.
space and all that.
that is a great question. I mean, it's interesting. I worked for quite a while with a guy who's a very prolific engineer producer who recorded some absolutely phenomenal, um, you've heard him on the radio before type tunes, and he was a fixture at a studio in Nashville. He was in LA for a while, ended up in Nashville, and their motto was, "If it doesn't rock, it sucks." And it was sort of the in your face rock and roll kind of utterance of this idea, but the idea is 100% true. If you have the best equipment in the world in the best room in the world, and maybe you even hire the best engineer, or you're a phenomenal engineer, you have the best technique with placing microphones and everything, if the song isn't good, it kind of doesn't matter. It's that's something that I think, unfortunately, there is so much gear out, which is awesome, and you're totally right, it's gotten better and better and better very consistently, especially over, let's say, the last 10 years. um, but it's easy to go online and you could spend 10 hours reading about which microphone cable to buy, because there are people who are willing to spend 10 hours writing blog posts and having discussion board, arguments and whatever.
Gotta
But
love gear sluts, right?
exactly, exactly. But like at the end of the day, that's not the thing that's going to make or break it. So when I'm talking to people, working with people who are trying to put together a home studio or a good workable setup, I say, okay, you're in charge of the talent. Like that's, you have to make that commitment. You do that stuff. That's not a part of my process. But when it comes to gear and room, you cannot escape the room unless you magically have one of these anechoic chambers on hand. It's
Right.
whatever you do is always going to have some characteristic of that room. So piling $100,000 worth of gear into, a $200 sheetrock and studs with no insulation and linoleum floor office is not going to do you much good. So I really try to help people understand that the room can make an incredible impact, and from the room, if the room is perhaps the most important thing, or maybe 50-50 with the microphone, because a good microphone placed well with the right pattern can help flatter the room a little bit more. But every step further you get from the microphone or from the source itself, the less important it becomes. People will spend all this money on some fancy converter or interface, and that's cool, awesome, I'm glad you're doing that. Like, quality is important at every stage, but if you're plugging a $50 off-brand microphone from eBay into a $500 or $5,000 converter,
Right.
is that really, have you prioritized effectively? I guess that's the question.
No, that's interesting because you'll see that, or you'll see somebody buy a kind of a high end Class A preamp or something,
Yeah,
and then they'll stick a pile microphone from China, into it, and it's like,
exactly.
oh.
I was on a Zoom call yesterday with a bunch of audio engineers from all over the place, and one guy from South America was giving this poor German guy the hardest time because he was using a Chinese microphone on his Zoom setup. And he said, "What's the world coming to? A German's using a Chinese microphone." He just couldn't get over it, but there's the right mic for the right job is
Right.
important too. There's a lot of talk of like, well, if you could only buy one mic? Well, there is no such one mic. Okay, what are you going to do with it? Okay, now we can limit it down. Okay, now it's going to do better at this than this. It's like a paintbrush. You'd be hard pressed to find a painter that only had one brush and could do everything they wanted to do with that. They could do a lot more than I could because I'm horrible at painting, but they're going to have their tools of their trade. And I really think microphones are analogous to paintbrushes. I think that's a very close analogy.
Yeah.
It's different sculpting, different shape, different contour, different level of detail.
Absolutely. That's interesting.
If somebody was sort of an amateur, and I know you've actually, Mike's helped me with a little setup, and you've come over to my house and given me some rundown of certain things that I need for my space, and
Yeah.
creating a little home studio. So if somebody's just starting out, uh, what might some basic equipment be? What are a few things they might need? Certainly an audio interface might not be something everybody is used to, and especially with some of the new USB mics that are out there, are fairly good. And not
Yeah.
that you have to promote any certain one, but maybe some that you've worked with, or a basic setup that people could use.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The audio interface, it's kind of this like, I feel like it's the hidden thing in this whole setup that especially for people who are just entering this world of podcasting or recording themselves or even doing voiceover from home. It's like this, I don't get it. What does this thing do? Well, microphones have developed over well over 100 years now, and they've sort of developed to work with a specific set of cables and electrical conditions. And so the audio interface is just the link that says, okay, I can take this pretty well established set of microphones, and I could take one from manufacturer A, B, or C. They're all going to work generally the same. I can plug that in, and then it converts that signal, which is still analog at this point, to digital, packages it nicely, and sends it via usually some sort of USB these days to the computer. So it's the middleman in the whole procedure. And then it'll do the same in reverse. So you've got software that you're creating music on. Let's say you're playing virtual synthesizers or you're looping drums or something like that. Then that goes digital via USB to that audio interface, which converts it back to analog and gets it to the right signal level and signal conditions that then it can go out to headphones or speakers. So it's kind of the hub of the modern small studio. Besides that, it's kind of the periphery, right? If you've got a computer and you've got an audio interface, then it comes down to a lot of kind of artistic choice or suiting your needs.
Well, and it used to be a big deal, like what kind of audio interface you'd get, because there was such a difference between the quality. And that's really, if anything has changed, I think in the last 10 years, more than anything, it's been how audio interfaces have become just like it's plug and play. You don't have to worry about it almost no matter where you get it, as long as it's a reputable, place, as long as the company that made it you can recognize.
Yeah, it's actually really similar to what's happened with flat panel. Well, we just think of them as computer monitors and TVs, but flat panel displays. There are not that many companies that make the actual raw components. People package them differently. They put different processing chips in them, whatever. Same thing's kind of true with audio interfaces. The real core, the brain of the operation, there's like 3 or 4 companies that make those chips. So people are packaging slightly different electronics or features or just overall aesthetic style to the thing around it. But yeah, I mean, I'm on like a $200 audio interface right now talking to you. It's fine. It's not anything fancy, but it works really well. And I guarantee if I opened it up and then I went back to the studio and opened up my $2,000 interface, I might see the same chip at the center of the whole thing.
Right.
The number of chips and the, sort of surrounding electronics would likely be very different. But at the core, the part that's doing the vast majority of the work is pretty much the same in most boxes these days. It's kind of crazy.
Well, so how is that the other stuff that's surrounding it affecting the sound so much? And also now that you can have these USB mics that go directly into the computer and bypass that hub, how is that affecting the sound? And certainly it's affecting the cost, but how is that affecting the quality?
Well, so the surrounding electronics do a lot to condition the signal in the analog world before it gets converted to digital. And that's still kind of I mean, it's obviously science, it's electrical engineering. I'm not sort of denigrating any of those great professions, but there's still an art to the design of the analog components more so. It's a lot less cut and dry. Digital, you put in a signal, you're looking for the same signal out, but represented with ones and zeros. On the analog side, people choose components or choose circuit architecture that tends to flavor the sound a little more. It's kind of got a little spice to it, or it's very neutral, or maybe it's got more or less high end or low end, and so that can have a pretty big effect. But the thing is, if you're kind of using a very standard, you're operating under standard conditions, it matters less and less. Where you tend to hear these things is way at the top of the range when you have things really cranked up. You've got a really soft source, or you're trying to capture detail like a classical piano that's playing pianissimo and has, very, very precise details and articulations. Okay, then maybe the $200 box I have now isn't going to quite hold up because of the front end analog stuff. But if I'm just talking into it, I bet if we did a blind test, we probably couldn't hear much of a difference.
And that applies all because it's the same electronics. Essentially, you're just moving the interface into the microphone. If you're using a USB microphone, it's essentially the same thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all in one package. And the big trade-off is with like this audio interface I've got sitting on my desk here, I could go across the room to my cabinet. I could grab a different microphone, plug that in, no problem. With a USB mic, you're confined to what's in that one package, which, for video conferencing, for a lot of sort of work from home stuff, it works really well. And the concept actually came from professional audio. There's a great German company called Neumann that's been making some of the world's best mics for basically since after World War II, actually during World War II. But they experimented with putting the digital conversion right into the microphone for really high-end classical productions.
Neumann did that. I had no idea.
Yeah, it was called the Solution D, and they were about $15,000 a piece when they came out.
And
they were insanely, and that was early 2000s. I think the first time I used one was 2003 or 2004. And it was fun because we used them and then we packed them off and sent them to New Zealand to be used for Lord of the Rings.
Cool.
But yeah, there were these incredible things. And what they've done is just changed the output. Now it goes to USB rather than, obviously there's been a lot of development in manufacturing that makes it possible to do these things that just, 20 years ago, there was no way you could make it affordable.
Well, and I think it again, you mentioned it before, it comes down to the right tool for the right job. Like for me, the biggest benefit of having, an interface per se is that I have, multiple outputs. And so inputs. So if my band comes over and play, I can record them all at the same time. Where with a USB, that becomes a lot more problematic.
Right. And a lot of times it's getting better, but there was a long time where if you plugged in one USB mic and then you tried to plug in another one, like the world would implode, your computer was
drivers go crazy.
Yeah. I don't know what to do with this. I can only choose one, it was some weird situation, and that's gotten better too. But yeah, it's nice to be able to say, hey, I'm going to record guitar and vocals. So I need 3 mics. Yeah. Cool. Done. But if you're doing video conferencing, and actually a lot of my colleagues at the university, they got a solid USB mic, something from Blue, or Audio Technica has a number of really good options now. And that's what they did remote lessons, instrumental and voice lessons on for the last year almost.
Yeah. Kind of moving into because I want to get into some a little bit more piano centric stuff, but before that, I want to maybe as a segue talk about the difference between recording in a studio versus recording live. And I don't mean live, like playing in a studio, but a live performance. Let's say it that way.
At a hall or at a venue or something.
Or with an audience.
The
difference between those kind of settings, and as an engineer, how do you approach that?
Oh man, it's wild. I love doing live stuff. Like that's actually what I was doing last night and Sunday and Friday. That's that's a lot of my life is, and now we're actually having audiences again, which is really nice. But it's a crazy game of, like, I tell people I'm professionally paranoid, because when I plan for a gig, I spend more time thinking about what's going to go wrong than I do, sometimes about what I'm actually focused, like, okay, I'm recording piano. Okay, I got that. That part's easy. I've done that before. What's going to go wrong at this new venue I've never been to? And figuring out ways around these potential problems. And the studio it's stable. A good studio, that's what it's there for. You should be able to walk in, plug something in, fire up Pro Tools or whatever DAW, and hit record. And at no point should there be a problem. Like it's been there, it's built into the room, it's ready to go. Whereas like Sunday, I was helping with a live stream for the American Pianist Association. So there was an audience and there were some people speaking throughout the program. And I was set up in a balcony next to the video control station. And I had my mics on the piano, sounded lovely. I took a split of the mic at the podium. And then they said, oh, well, there's also going to be a wireless mic because there's going to be a couple of special presentations. Okay, cool. Oh, of course, little did I know that the two places for me to tap into the wireless mic system that was amplifying for the audience in-house was 150 feet away and 250 feet away. So
run back and forth.
Yeah, so it was like, okay, I'm really glad I brought 150 feet. I brought 3 extra 50-foot cables, ended up using all 3 of them just for this tapping a wireless mic. And that's, to me, that's the sort of stuff.
It's the Boy Scout rule.
Exactly. You become a Boy Scout, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Wow.
Man, I may not need it, but I probably will at some point.
And it's crazy because I started doing that stuff in New York. So you have this really crazy dichotomy where it's, if you can't carry it upstairs in one trip, whatever you leave downstairs is going to be gone when you get back.
Yeah.
Or I need all this extra stuff. So you start really like, okay, what can I do? You find these crazy solutions. I have like a rolling suitcase that turns into a backpack. And I'm sure I look like some off-brand cosplay stormtrooper or something, with a mic stand sticking out one side and whatever. But man, I could take it on the subway. Like, I was good. So
That's awesome.
I saw a great video. It was an Adam Neely video where he's doing a live gig and he's got his bass and his amp and the whole thing. And he's got a hand truck, wrapped in plastic because it's going to rain in New York, and just taking it, rolling it to the gig, and it's it's all there. It ain't pretty, but it gets the job done.
Yeah, exactly. You gotta wheels are glorious, loading docks are glorious, having a truck is glorious, having a union crew to help unload is the best. It's just it's crazy, these little things you start to appreciate.
Yeah. I would wonder, how much does the audience affect your recording? Because when you're going to a live situation or a hall, you're going to set up everything when nobody's there. And I'm sure the audience coming is going to affect the sound a lot.
Yeah, in multiple ways. You're right. The acoustics, and this is something that has changed a lot in the acoustics realm. In the last 15 years, I'd say, 10 years maybe, there's been a real focus on designing seats for concert halls. And people will go crazy with how they design the seats because they try to make it so if a seat is occupied with an average, they look up the CDC's average mass and weight or in height and all this good stuff. And okay, if an average person sits in this hall, it'll do this acoustically. Now, if we take the person out, we want to design the bottom of the chair and the back of the chair. So when it's not covered, it does the same thing acoustically, which is crazy.
Wow.
But so many great halls weren't built in the last 10, 20 years, right? Most good halls were built a long time ago, so they don't have this. And yeah, you'll see people, doing all kinds of crazy stuff when they have to like record a concert, but then they might have to record a few spots after the fact with no audience. They'll have every crew member come sit down just to try to help out, which usually is not nearly enough. You'll see people trucking in acoustic treatment that they just sort of throw in chairs to try to emulate the sound. But then there's the other side. A lot of times you're so focused on, oh, we've got this beautiful space. We want to capture the nice sound of this concert hall. And then everyone shows up and somebody's futzing with a candy wrapper and somebody's going through their purse and like 3 people are having a conversation at the back. And all of a sudden you've got that aspect too. So you're dealing with the acoustic difference, plus all of a sudden there's just way more noise that you're trying to get rid of or reduce coming from behind where the main focus is.
A lot less controlled. What about the trade-off? Because I mean, obviously all of these things are trade-offs, and this whole conversation is about trade-offs, trying to figure out what, the best solution, because the aspect of going back to record something, what is the trade-off today? Well, let me back up. We had Mark Ainley a couple times, and we talk about like old recordings, and we talked about the how they're not pristine and perfect in a lot of ways. But now today, it's like you expect that to come, especially from a top artist.
Yeah.
So what's the trade-off between having the excitement, the feel of a live performance versus, going back to fix a few notes here and there?
I love live performance recordings. I think, and I do a lot of jazz and classical, and jazz is a no-brainer, right? Because there's such an interplay that happens, and you will, because it's never the same twice in a row. The solos are different. The interplay is different between players. Man, the drummer and the bass player did this really great lock-in thing under the trumpet solo, and that might never happen again. So that one's easy. But for classical, I think there's a sense of urgency that's there when it's live, because you don't get the luxury, I think, as a performer. And granted, I haven't been a performer for quite a few years now, but Elias maybe can tell me if this is crazy or not. But my own sort of personal theory is you don't have the luxury of focusing on, oh man, I just missed a note, because your brain is constantly on top of what's happening now and what's coming next. Whereas when you're in that more sort of clinical studio setting, and not studio per se, but when you have the luxury of going back and recording the same part 16 times, you don't push yourself on to part B, even if part A, got a little ragged at times. And I think the flow gets interrupted so much more that way. Even my favorite live recordings that had sessions after or before to hit certain spots that were going to potentially be a problem, so much of it still comes from that live performance. The energy is just, it's different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even in a recording space too. I always think about the difference between a live performance and a recording performance, where you're just playing for the microphone, and the nerves are very different. In a live performance, usually you're very nervous at the beginning, or at least I am. And as you start to play and as you start to get into it, you feel a little bit more relaxed and a little better. And as you get towards the end, the closer you get towards the end, the more relaxed you feel in a way,
Right.
because it's almost over, and sort of the elation after is great. Even if you messed up, it's just, oh, thank God that's over. But with the recording, it's almost the opposite. I remember, because Brett actually was the recording engineer for 2 of my albums, and at the beginning of them, when I first go in to record, it's super relaxed. I'm like, oh, I've played this stuff so many times in performances. I know how it goes, especially the beginnings are usually pretty straightforward. And as soon as I start playing, then, you get 10 seconds in, you're like, wow, I better not mess up now, because I've already started and it's going well. And by the time you're a minute in, oh my God, I'm so nervous about missing. And then you start cramping up, I guess, and the energy's sort of gone and becomes sterile. So it's much more difficult.
You end up in an anechoic chamber.
Yeah. just
It's
alone
a
with your
weird
thoughts.
Right.
yeah, it's such a weird thought process, and you try to get out of that and try to say, "Oh, just play through it, do one full take, and then you can come back and spot check." Actually, I've also heard in some live recordings that are done for radio, let's say, I think for the, Canadian, there's a national radio broadcast once, and I remember, seeing a performance, and then they were able to do a spot check or something after, or a little bit of a recording afterwards, and
Yeah.
plug that in. So, if you have
Yeah,
the
and
luxury of doing that, I guess it's okay. But
yeah, that's a really common setup, especially for large orchestra where
mm,
it's, you know, tens of thousands of dollars an hour just for the musicians to be there.
mhm,
They'll do like, let's say it's a sort of large town orchestra where they might do um, Thursday, Friday, Saturday evening performances, Sunday matinee.
mhm,
They'll record dress rehearsal Wednesday, and it depends sometimes on what's in the orchestra's contract. Then they'll record Thursday, Friday, Saturday. They'll record Sunday. Everyone will take a dinner break,
mhm,
and during that dinner break, the conductor, the producer, the engineer, everyone sits back and they sort of have been marking their scores and circling parts. Oh, we didn't get this yet. We didn't get this yet. The orchestra will come back for maybe an hour or two after dinner and they'll say, okay, we need to hit bar 34 in the first movement. We need to hit the B section of the fourth movement.
mhm.
And it would be great if we could get the first five notes of the clarinet solo. And they'll just hit
Wow.
those spots. Yeah.
Wow. And then knock
That's
it out, and then you have everything you need.
Exactly. So you take, 95% of it is that live stuff, but then it's just that, oh man, it just never quite locked in here. So we'll just get a few bars on either side and we'll be able to drop it in.
Yeah,
it's
and
so amazing to me from having played to many click tracks, being able to do that in a classical setting is pretty wild to think about.
Yeah, well, that's a standard part of the classical producer's toolkit is colored pencils for marking scores and highlighters and all that good stuff. But then usually a tuner and a metronome. So if on Thursday night it was a little faster than it was the other nights, we need to know that maybe we can't use that material to edit back and forth. We're going to have to pick one or the other. And then when we do get to Sunday evening, okay, listen, 3 out of the 4 nights it started right about 136. So that's where we should start now. That'll give us the best chance.
wow. And I'm sure mixing from those different, days, I mean, even the same hall, the same musicians, the same music and everything, the audience is gonna be different. The humidity is gonna be different,
Yeah.
in the hall. It's just gonna alter the sound. Somebody's gonna have a little more energy, the clarinetist one day, and the bassist another day, and the balance is gonna be different. So mixing those different takes is, an art in itself.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, my wife, who's also an engineer, was working on something last night, and I came home. I had a radio broadcast, and I came home, and I was sort of zonked, and she looked like she'd had a rough one too, and she said, "I've been working on this one stupid edit all day," and she working on a lot, but that's where she ended up, and she said, "Can I play this for you?" And she sat down and she played it, and incredible. Contemporary music ensemble, very
Mm.
very good group. But there was just one pizzicato that was different in every single take. It was
Oh.
just
Oh,
and that's right where they needed. There was a note that was under the pits that kind of wavered in pitch, and it was like, what are we gonna find? And I was like, yeah, I don't know what to tell you. That is a rough one. Like it's just
oh man.
yeah. So you get creative, and one of the big things that's available now in so many software platforms for editing is you can even take just a specific clip and you can maybe EQ it and change level
Mm,
just to try to help match. It's never going to be perfect, but maybe it gets close enough that it sort of isn't noticeable to the
mhm.
average listener, and you can sort of sneak it in there for a second.
Yeah, well, you mentioned before too, before we got on, a project that you're working on, and I wonder, now that we're talking about EQing and getting all these levels and putting so many pieces of the puzzle together, if you could talk to us about that and what are the challenges? I think it was for a band.
Yeah, yeah. So a great artist up in Montreal, Beth Mckenna. She's a fantastic composer. She's done a lot of combo tunes and a lot of big band tunes. And we knew each other up in Montreal. And then I've worked on a couple of her big band albums since I've been back in the US. And she decided to kind of go back to her roots. And so this has been in the works. Obviously COVID threw a wrench in this like everything else. But she's been putting together a combo album, and I'm trying to think, I guess it's a quintet, and killer musicians, great players, fun guys. And so they tracked up in Montreal, and I got the tracks, and I do a lot of straight ahead jazz these days, especially. I seem to do, a lot of just kind of standard combo tunes, very normal, traditional instrumentation. And so in my mind, that's just kind of where my brain went. And so I get these tracks, and it was wild. It's awesome. It's, these crazy guitar effects, and, there's piano, but also there's organ, and there's keys, and there's a Wurlitzer, and there's, Rhodes, and there's, I'm like, okay, I was expecting like 25 tracks, and I've got like 50. Okay, cool. So, then you really start to go in, and it's fun for me as a mixing engineer at that point, because the musicians have created an arrangement, but I can sort of help guide. I'm like the tour guide. I'm the docent at a museum. There's this incredible landscape that the musicians have built and recorded, and I kind of help guide the listener through it. Oh, hey, have you paid attention to the Rhodes part? That's kind of cool. And I push that up a little and get people into that. And then, but there's this other, and I sort of, I like to think of it as benevolent manipulation. I sort of help tell the listener, oh, have you considered listening to this part? Sneak it up a little, or highlight it, or help it come out, or move to the center, or whatever it needs to happen. And that's when you really start digging into really deep, heavy EQ, where you're really sculpting sounds to fit in this very dense landscape.
Well, talk about that for a second, because I think people don't understand, especially with a heavy layered, piece where there's just lots of music, lots of sound, in kind of in our main hearing, part of our hearing spectrum. Talk about the kind of the challenges and the choices that you have to make to make those work.
Yeah. I think you hit on something that sort of sparked a common thought that I have. Is I think a lot of people don't appreciate how much is crammed into a lot of especially popular music. They're like, oh, there was a voice, and there was like a bass, and I heard some drums, and I'm pretty sure there was a keyboard in there.
Yeah.
And then you look at what's actually going on, and there is 50 keyboards, and there is 3 drum machines, and then there's samples, and there's 15 layers of vocals, plus there's 25 background vocals. And it's this massive thing to get the sound that we have sort of evolved and become used to the point that we just say, oh, it's just these few things.
Simple, yeah.
And
it's so produced. I mean, you're almost an artist as an engineer or as a producer, but you're one of the artists in a way, or maybe the overarching artist.
Well, that's something else interesting, because we started to see the producer as the artist more. And that's a fairly recent change. People like DJ Khaled and Chainsmokers, and people who they're not singing, they're not playing a guitar, they're not a band. You look at some of these albums, they don't sing on any track. They don't rap on any track. They're not, they're not sort of the artist in a traditional sense, but they composed all that. They put those parts together. They wrote the lyrics, and then they went out and found a singer to sort of be at the front of the stage, which is really interesting. So it is kind of that way. And I don't work on a lot of that heavy, thick, dense pop stuff, but it is super fun with a project like Beth's new album, where, you have these layers, and you have to say, okay, there's bass, there's a low guitar part, and there's an organ pad part that's playing fairly low notes. I can't have all of this happening at once, right? There's too much. You're sort of cramming too much into too small a space. So at some point you have to make the decision, okay, this is the most important thing. And The others might just have to tone it down a little. I have to turn them down, or I have to EQ them in a way where they're not going to detract from what really should be the main focus. And that changes a lot over a song. People think, oh, it's just the vocalist the whole time.
Yeah.
In some songs, but not always.
Right. Wow.
Absolutely. And if you were to, especially on modern, like kind of pop rock tracks, this is the case, but I imagine it's in a smaller, lesser degree, it's the same on a project like this. If you were to listen, or if one was to listen to those individual tracks, they might feel thin, or they might feel not like they don't sound quite good, but it's when you put them all together that you go, okay, I see the vision of why it had to be that way.
Yeah, it kind of cracks me up. I think vocals are actually the one that sticks out most to me.
Yeah.
When you listen to a soloed up vocal, and this happens, it seems to happen every couple of years. Some disgruntled intern at a studio steals the hard drive and releases the soloed vocal of some pop star, right? And everyone's like, "Oh, it's out of tune and whatever." And that's not what I'm listening to, because I already know that they're gonna tune it up and they're going to do whatever. I'm like, oh man, that sounds really bright, or that sounds kind of thin,
Exactly.
but it works. It's like looking at one piece of a puzzle and criticizing the whole work. It's just, it has to be seen in the context of everything going on, because you're totally right. You listen to, maybe the bass track sounds really aggressive and grungy, and you think, God, that's awful. And then you hear it with the whole tune and you go, oh, that fits in exactly where it needs to.
Fits in, yeah.
It's almost. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and it seems to be such a psychoacoustic thing. Like it's like our again, it goes back to our brains. Like, how do we perceive sound?
Yeah,
yeah. I think in the classical world, at least, when people used to talk about hearing Heifetz up close, or really great violinists, they almost sounded grainy or too harsh, but that needed to really carry in a large space. And so if you were sitting 20 or 100 feet away, it sounded great, but almost too close, and it's, wow, that's really an edgy sound.
Yeah. Well, I think the same is true of piano too.
Yeah.
When I'm lucky enough to record an amazing player like you, Elias, or some of the other people I've worked with
much bigger names that you've recorded.
Well, doesn't matter. You guys are all these phenomenal players, and I have to move the mics further back for you, because you play with an intensity and you sort of dig in and elicit the sound to speak more than a younger player who's a bit more timid and hasn't sort of realized their ability to fill a concert hall. Right. I think that's the big difference. You get people who are used to playing for 500 to 2,000 people for a concert in a big hall. They play very different than somebody who plays in their living room for fun.
Right. For family, yeah. Right.
That just made me think of Frederick True. We had him on, and how he talked about learning, and they put, you imagine these iron weight on his wrist for him to practice.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. His teacher did one thing. I'm like, oh my God, that's awful. But luckily he came out of it,
Yeah, I guess it worked.
It worked for him, but wow.
Well, it was hilarious. He said something like, I had I had great stamina, but my tone was terrible.
Yeah. I used to know, I won't mention any affiliations, but I knew a jazz trumpet player in Arizona who said he'd work on his chops. He traveled a lot, and traveled a lot for non-musical work. So he would work on his chops, keep himself in shape by tucking like a button or something on a string behind his lips, and then he'd just pull on it like while he was on the plane.
Wow.
And then he'd just keep his face tight. And I'm like, the dude can scream, but that can't be good. Like that, there's no way that should happen. Like,
wow, that's amazing.
Crazy, right? Yeah.
Sacrifice for art, baby. Sacrifice for art.
Doing whatever you got to do, I guess.
It's like those I don't know if you ever saw those, but the grips, you can buy them in different strengths, and I got a set of those once, the light, medium, and hard. And I think when I was in college. And I wouldn't recommend those to people. But they're kind of, if you use them lightly, and they're, you're not going to injure yourself or get repetitive stress syndrome or disorder, you'll be okay. But there are better ways.
Oh man. Yeah, I have such a respect for, there's such a delicate musculature that musicians develop for their instrument, for their playing style, for their genre. It's just, I think every time I hear about a football player who has an injury or something, professional athlete, and they have this incredible, team
Yeah,
of sports medicine specialists and occupational therapists and people who help them, regain their abilities. And like the exact same is true of musicians. It's a delicate, precise set of movements that have to be done very consistently, and every bit is deserving of that kind of attention to make sure that everyone's in good shape and operating efficiently.
yeah. Well, you're a performer first and foremost, and before you got into, I mean, now you have a doctorate in recording engineering, and you have tons of experience, but that aspect of it too, and the training
Yeah.
that it takes to get to that level, professional level. So,
Yeah, I when I was playing more, I took Alexander lessons,
mm,
Alexander technique, and it did a lot for me. I had a lot of tension, especially when I try to play drum set fast. I
mm,
would tense up because your body naturally thinks fast must be hard, hard must be rigid.
yeah,
It's sort of a natural response. And working with that instructor for like a semester, realizing like I don't need to be, kind of rock solid hardened in every regard trying to play fast. That's making my whole life more difficult.
yeah,
And it was like a total light bulb moment for me that, sometimes our body, if we're not very consciously manipulating our body works against us, and that
yeah.
can change your technique.
Yeah, yeah, percussion is it's so easy to go down the wrong path there.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, piano too. I mean,
yeah.
carpal tunnel is such a huge thing
Yeah.
for a lot of people who have these repetitive hand motions. It's very
Yeah, and we
tough.
don't we don't talk about the physical, like you said, we don't have the team of doctors behind us like a sports person, but also the psychological stuff, when you're again with a team and you've got the sports psychologists and all that. We had Ingela Onstead on a long time ago talking about how it's
Yeah,
almost taboo in music, at least in classical music, but I think in other genres too. If you show that you have these weaknesses and you're not in top form all the time, yeah, you're not seen as a real artist. So,
yeah. I always thought it was kind of crazy. I feel like when I was still playing, it was sort of the beginning of people talking more about taking beta blockers
hmm
for performance anxiety,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
you'd get a room full of 10 musicians, and I was sort of transitioning more towards my role as an engineer, and so I would talk to people more one on one, and I'd sort of, as I developed relationships, I would find out that maybe these 10 people that I worked with regularly, that six of them were on beta blockers, but if all 10 of them were in the room and I said, oh, does anyone take beta blockers, or I found this bottle, whose is it, somebody dropped this, no one
Nobody.
would say anything, no
Yeah.
one would
yeah,
volunteer. And I really hope, I feel like at the university, as much as the last 18 months, 2 years has been awful, I hope one of the few silver linings is I feel like um, it pushed things in the music world to a tipping point where I really hope that mental health and physical wellness
hmm
can be discussed more. I think that's
yeah,
critical for every aspect of the industry.
Oh, absolutely. I think, and one of the things I try to emphasize with my students is, we're, it's kind of trite, but I try to keep it light. We don't work at piano, we play the piano.
Yeah.
We need to remember that it should be fun. At the end of the day, it should be something enjoyable and something meaningful. And, if it's not, if things are getting in the way of that, we need to maybe not reassess our total path, but reassess how we're perceiving, the things that we're doing that cause us to not feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's about learning good habits too.
Yeah.
I feel like it's an interesting position. Once you're in grad school, there's a wide array of programs, obviously, and some programs are hyper competitive and very stressful, and others are more focused on growth and everything in between. But at undergrad, I think there's such a pressure, especially for people who are planning on being performers, that like you better be in that practice room for 8 hours a day, and you better be perfect when you hit the stage. And that pressure needs to be there to a certain extent, but forming the habits of, if I'm not being productive anymore, I don't need to be unproductive for 3 more hours just
Right.
because
That's
somebody,
important.
Man,
Yeah.
that's huge. Yep.
Finding ways to work efficiently and productively. For me too, I used to be a mix for 12 hours kind of guy, and the last 4 hours were worthless or sometimes even counterproductive. So why would I keep doing that?
That's so true. And people don't realize how you talk about the ears adapting over time. Try mixing a track for 12 hours and then going back and listening to the next day and go, what did I do to this thing?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a bad feeling. I hate it. I hate it.
Diminishing returns.
As a guy that does know a lot of the behind the scenes, turning the musician into a magician, a bit. You kind of see the how the magic happens, and by doing that, you've over time really tuned your ears. You've really, that's kind of a master. That's a skill that people, that's very important. Maybe if you don't mind, give our audience a few tips on how maybe not listen like an audio engineer, but how can they listen to music better, or what are things that people can do to just appreciate, what's going on in their listening experience?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing is really realizing the difference between hearing and listening. We do so much hearing in our lives. Like we're in a department store and there's music playing. We're hearing it. That modulating air pressure is hitting our eardrums. It's turning into nerve impulses. It's there, but we're not really listening to it. Listening is much more active than hearing. That's sort of the way I break it down. It's active, an active, engaging activity. And a lot of times it's really just moving distractions away. If you're sitting down and you want to listen to a record and you really want to enjoy it, don't have the TV on, don't check your email, put your phone away. Because the more our brain has a limited bandwidth, there's only so much sensory information we can take in. And the more other sensory information we try to jam into our brain, something's got to give. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's the sense of sound. We sort of get distracted very easily by visual things. So removing distractions and focusing on listening. And then once you do that, start breaking it down, listen to the voice and try to focus on the voice, and then listen to the bass and try to focus on the bass. And a lot of times just telling ourselves, let's focus on this. It's no different than when we're at a party and our friend's talking to us and we say, I'm going to focus on what he's saying and not the people spilling booze off in the corner. Right? We have the ability. We just a lot of times don't use it. And I think that's
it's
one
hard.
of the things.
It takes energy.
It does. It's exhausting.
But you know what? Like I remember as a kid, and it breaks my heart. I don't see my kids doing this, but I remember, having kind of a big. My dad had a nice little turntable, and I'd get my Rush album or the Star Wars album or whatever, and I'd literally put my feet against the speaker and turn off the lights and listen to an entire album. Or albums plural. My friends, we would do that. We just sit there and we weren't talking. We were just listening to music, and that art has really disappeared in our kind of high go society.
I think I'll probably get some hate for this, but there's a vast contingent, a strong but vocal minority these days that swears that vinyl sounds better than digital. And I would argue that the big difference is not that it sounds better, but that vinyl was a format that forced you to listen actively. You didn't take the turntable in your car with you and listen while you were swearing at traffic on your commute. You didn't listen to it on the subway.
Yeah.
You sat down and you listened to it. And I think,
That's a big part.
I think the biggest difference is in the fact that it really forced people to listen.
Mhm.
That is a fascinating
That's
take.
interesting. Yeah, I wonder if there could be some sort of testing, side by side and looking at the quality difference. And there might be, but it's probably small, but the experiential difference is going to be huge.
Yeah, I would love at some point if I can convince some granting agency to part with a substantial amount of monetary resource. I would love to,
Yeah.
to do that. Have
Yeah.
people listen to the same thing. Basically,
Yeah.
set up a nice double-blind sort of placebo test, but have them engaging in other activities or distracted
Yeah.
versus focused, and see if that's where the difference really comes from. I
Yeah,
think it
that's
could be
amazing.
done, but it'd be interesting. It'd be fun.
Yeah.
It really would. But I think your advice is spot on. Like if we take just a moment just to sit and listen and try to active listen, I think that'll make a huge difference in that experience, and you'll appreciate everything about that experience better.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love going back to old records that I never listened to that carefully and just putting them on. And I always discover something new. There's a tambourine part in the chorus that's buried. That's cool.
Right.
There's just some little ear candy thing that
Where if it wasn't there, you would notice the difference.
exactly. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
built perfectly, but it's out of the way enough that if you're not really carefully listening, it just flies under the radar.
Oh,
That's awesome.
that's great. Well, we're talking to Brett Leonard. He's the owner of BLP Audio. He's the director of music technology programs at University of Indianapolis. Among all of his great accomplishments, one of which is to be on this program. I
Amen.
appreciate,
Yes.
I appreciate you taking the time to be on here, Brett. It's been
It's a pleasure.
again so much fun, and again, it's one of those things like. It's funny, kind of behind the scenes for our audience. Like we all kind of came on with kind of like, we didn't really pre-plan this program.
Yeah.
But audio is one of those things that's kind of unending. You can talk about that, about,
I certainly
for a long
could.
time. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there's so much to it, and there's so much more nuance than
people
than
realize.
what we give credit to. So
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. This has been great.
absolutely. Elias, thank you again.
Yeah, thanks, Mike and Brett. It's awesome.
Yeah. Great seeing you guys again.
Absolutely. We'll have to do it again. Brett Leonard, thanks again. This is Mike Levitt, and you've been listening to And If Love Remains.